Good morning, everybody. We're in our fifth and final day of our virtual summit, and it's been a great 4 days, and we're ready to kick off our fifth day. I'm so honored to have our speaker today, John Eagle Sr. We have a mutual friend, Frank Kuntz, who I know a lot of you know a lot about, and I've been hoping to meet this man for years, and finally last year we did get to meet in person, and I got to listen to him speak, and he really is a fascinating speaker. John is a nationally known consultant with over 36 years of experience working with children, families, and communities. He has 26 years of experience consulting with federal, state, and tribal agencies and is considered an expert on systems of care, the wraparound process, equine assisted wraparound therapeutic horsemanship, cultural competence, leadership, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and the Native American Graves Protection Act. John is a former tribal historic preservation officer for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and has done numerous trainings at tribal, state, and national conferences across the United States and Canada. He has served on numerous tribal, state, and national advisory boards during his career. John also does an equine therapy program called Becoming One with the Spirit of the Horse, which is on my bucket list to do one day. And I also want to point out too that while we've been battling for the Theodore Roosevelt National Park wild horses, John and the Standing Rock tribe have also been very vocal about keeping those horses in the park, and we thank you for all the help and support that you've given for that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John, who is going to share the wisdom of the spirit of the horse with us today. Thanks for being here, John.
Thank you for asking. Almatakhape, apete kile chantewashte na pe chuzapalo. Kahakaska emache ape na washichu ea John Eagle Sr. Hemacha, hunkpapalo kota Hemacha na iamoslaha emata. You know, when I joined the United States Army in 1986, they asked me if I spoke a foreign language, and I said, yes, English. I spent the next hour or so doing push-ups. You know, this is in England, but the language that I just greeted you in was one of the first languages spoken on this continent. And in our ways and in our understandings and our belief systems, that's the most respect I can show you, is to speak to you in one of the first languages ever spoken on this continent. It makes kind of a challenge, I think, to function in mainstream society, because I come from a ancient people, deeply rooted in ancient beliefs and deeply connected with our environment. But yeah, when my dad first walked me to a school bus, and every time I tell this story, I have that vivid memory of him holding my hand. You know, from that day until today, I've been indoctrinated in Western European school of thought, and so have all of you. And therein lies the challenge for me as a Hunkpa Lakota, is to function within two different worldviews. Not only function within those worldviews, but to find a way to create paradigm shifts amongst others. And I've actually spent my career doing just that, helping people to think about things in a different way. And it gets challenging sometimes. And I always kind of caution people when they come to me or they come to my trainings or workshops that I'm going to make it sound easy because I've been doing it for so long. But there's nothing easy about creating paradigm shifts and creating systemic changes. One of them has to do with these beautiful relatives that I'm going to talk to you about this morning. You know, in my language, one of the things that I said is I greeted you today with a good-hearted handshake, and I also called you my relatives. And when you think about the beauty and understanding and the deep spiritual connection that our elders taught us, it's so that if we look at each other as relatives, then we're going to be good listeners. We're going to listen to each other. But it also lays that foundation where maybe someday we're not going to agree with each other. Maybe someday we're not going to be happy with one another. But as long as we look at each other as relatives, we're always going to have that to fall back on. Therein lies a depth of understanding that for us is generation. Because as Lakota people, we're taught to look 7 generations down the road. So maybe that's why I accepted this invitation, was in the hopes that 7 generations from now, my grandchildren, who I'm not even going to meet, I won't even know their names, and maybe they won't even know mine, but that hope and that prayer that they're going to have a better experience in this world than I had. And things are getting better. I've had a better experience in this road than my parents, and they had a better experience than my grandparents, and going all the way back. And I was just recently invited to Santagleshka University down in Mission, South Dakota, to talk about horses. One of the things I told them is that, we've coined the phrase historic trauma and intergenerational grief. And as tribal peoples, we've become accustomed and knowledgeable talking about the effects of the Indian Wars and forced assimilation, residential schools, and failed US Indian policy. But what we seem to have forgotten was how traumatic the loss of the horse was. How traumatic the loss of the horse was to my people. And I'm sure that many of you on the call, if not all of you, are horse people. And I'm sure that you look at horses in a very similar way that I look at them. They're not a horse. That word doesn't do them any justice at all. They're relatives. To me, it's like my children, my sons and my daughters. I feel a deep sense of responsibility to care for them. Because we create artificial environments for horses. And what I mean by that is if you look at horses on BLM lands, quote unquote wild horses, they're living how our creator intended them to live. And just like us, they have this ancient connection to their environment. They have an ancient social structure, an ancient family structure, and an ancient language. But through colonization or domestication of a horse, we change all of it. We disrupt that connection they have. We change that social structure. We change that family structure, and we even change their language, even with the best of intentions. And that's one of the things that I hope people understand, is that even with the best of intentions, sometimes we cause trauma. Because when you take a horse from everything that it's known, everything that it knows, and put it in a different environment, it creates changes in it. And we're actually the ones that create dependency. Horses actually don't need us. they they don't need us at all. And that's one of the things that I think mainstream society fails to see, is that out of everything in creation, we were created last. And out of everything in creation, we're the most pitiful thing out here. Horses, they know they're smarter than us. They know they're faster than us. They know they're stronger than us. And yet, they really want to be in our day. Horses really want to be in our day. And when people come to me and I take them out to my horses, I see the same thing happen over and over again. A lot of people will say, I've been around horses all my life. I've had a lot of rodeo people come to me, even champion saddlebronc riders and champion bareback riders. And I see the same thing play out. That when that horse approaches them, it triggers something. It triggers, I'm not sure what it triggers, but to me, it almost looks like fear. Because when a horse wants to be in your day, it's going to want to be right here. That horse is going to want to be right here, and it's going to want to exchange breath with you. And I don't know how many of you got to experience that, had the privilege of exchanging breaths with the horse, but they have the sweetest smelling breath on earth. But when that moment comes, I also see people kind of shy them away, swing their hands up or jerk their heads back or scare them off, breaking those connections, breaking what that horse was intending to do. So when Chris asked me for a title, I thought about it. Shumna, the, the wisdom of a spirit of a horse. They're much more than a horse. Again, like I said earlier, to call them a horse doesn't do them any justice at all. My language, how we look at a horse, our word is shumkwaka. Shumka waka. The first part of that word, shumka, and here's here's the corruption of my language because of, and I don't mean to offend, but because of Christian influences and because of English influences of people trying to translate back and forth with my language. But shumka is our word for dog. But again, dog doesn't do any justice to who they are. It doesn't do any justice at all to what a dog is and the gifts that a dog carries. But for those of you on this call, chances are if you're horse people, you're also dog people. So I want you to kind of think about what gifts do dogs bring in this world? What kind of gifts do dogs have? And I always ask this question. And anytime that horse people gather on my homelands, I always ask this question. Because dogs are beautiful, they're pure, and they're innocent. We could spend the rest of the day talking about the gifts that they bring. Because dogs, like horses, are healers. They have the same healing abilities. And that's what I find interesting about my language is when you break it apart, you take the root words out, it gives you deeper understandings of what my ancestors were expressing. And they named horses shumkwaka. So shumka, beautiful, pure, and innocent. Well, ka today, because again, Christian influences on my language and English influences, they say holy, sacred, and mysterious. But that's not what waka means. Waka, in its most literal form, means both good and bad. Means the ability to create life and the ability to destroy life. Now, when you put those two words back together, shumkwaka, our word for horse, you come up with a spiritual being that is both good and bad, has ability to create life and destroy life, and is beautiful and pure. That's our understandings of what a horse is. And again, since point of contact with my people and the immigrants in this country, we've been struggling, trying to help people to understand our worldview. And Chris and I were having a conversation before she let all of you in, talking about advocacy for wild horses and the horses at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And she asked me, about tribal perspectives. And I said, unfortunately, in this country, tribal people are an afterthought. I want things to come to us first and see what we think about these things. No one thinks to come to us and try to create relationships with us to see what we can do to help in the defense of what we call Eota Shumkwanka Ayate, our cherished horse nation. Because as Lakota people, we have point of origin stories of the horse. Point of origin stories that go back to ancient times when my elders say, Ahana Oyate Wajila. That long time ago, there was just one people here. And as a tribal historic preservation officer in federal consultation, I used to get a kick out of archaeologists when they'd start talking about Paleo-Indian. Paleo-Indian are people that they don't know who they are. They just kind of believe they were the first here, but we know. It's in the telling of our creation story. And it's in our star knowledge. And again, I just want to share with all of you that all this foolishness going on in this country, I think if we can ever get to a place where we acknowledge and appreciate our diversity, we're going to once again see peace. Because even tribal people, thinking about am I an American Indian or am I Native American? People always ask me that question. What should we call you? Well, who I really am predates all of that. You know, so am I an American? Well, they passed a federal law in the early 1900s, a citizenship act that made us Americans without even asking our permission. But it was so that our grandparents could go fight World War One and World War Two. So do I buy into those concepts? And if I were to show you my tribal ID, it says that I come from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, but those four words don't accurately reflect who I am. That's the United States government says that I am. And herein lies part of the problem, because right now, your federal agencies, your national parks, your Bureau of Land Management are looking at horses as livestock. Therein lies the problem. There are no protections for livestock. So going back to my enrollment, you know, when you think about every single one of us enrolled in the Standing Rock Sioux tribe have the very same three numbers in our enrollment, 302, because that's the POW camp that we come from. POW camp 302, left over from the Indian Wars, when tribes were under the Department of War. And that letter and the rest of those numbers behind my enrollment give testimony to the fact that my mom and my dad had to justify my experience through blood quantum. But the only thing that mainstream society keeps blood quantum on are horses, dogs, and Indians. And my wife created a paradigm shift in me a couple of years ago when I was talking like this, and I shared that with the group. Horses, dogs, and Indians. It's the only thing mainstream society keeps track of blood quantum on it. My wife said, well, that's good company to keep, horses and dogs. Because horses and dogs are spiritual beings, have ability to heal, and have a wisdom of spirit beyond any of our capabilities. I'm sure those of you that are dog people had those experiences where maybe you weren't feeling well. Maybe you were sad, or you were lonely, or your feelings were hurt, or you were stressed, and that beautiful, pure, and innocent being, that dog, come and lay down at your feet. You didn't have to tell it. It just knew. And I don't know how many times, you know, when I go outside to my dogs when I'm not feeling right, they just know. They'll come and sit with me until feeling better again, and they leave. Well, guess who else does that? Horses. And when I think about BLM and those freeze brands, kind of triggers me. You know, it reminds me of my enrollment number. But at least my enrollment number is on a card, and they didn't tattoo it to my arm. They didn't tattoo it, freeze brand it to my neck. And I know that many of you are wild horse advocates, but I'm in the business of trying to dispel the myth of a wild horse. Because when you say that they're wild, it creates a culture of fear. People get scared of them. You know, how many of you witnessed or followed the recent roundup in Theodore Roosevelt National Park, where they chased them around with helicopters? Yeah, how many of you, and I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, seen the BLM roundups? Again, where they chase them around in helicopters. I've walked through Theodore Roosevelt National Parks. I'm sure many of you have. I've interacted with those quote unquote wild horses. I've studied their social structures, their family structures, try to get in tune to that language, the way that they communicate. Yeah, have absolutely nothing to fear. And that's the thing about us too, is that we have an energy. We have an energy about us. Same thing with that horse. Same thing with everything in creation. Because in our worldview, everything in creation has a spirit, even a rock. But we're oftentimes not aware of that energy and how we're projecting it. So horse people, you know that when you lift your energy, it pushes horses away from you. When you draw your energy in, it draws them to you. Even quote unquote wild horses. I don't know that they're wild because when I think about American history and Western expansion, that was a narrative they created to take it all away. Was to call the people here wild, to call the animal nations here wild, to call this the Wild West, the Wild Frontier. It was a narrative they created to take it all away. And this is deeply ingrained in American society because, and I don't mean to offend any of you, and I'm not here to hurt feelings. I'm not here to point fingers or place blame. But I don't think Americans are that knowledgeable about their own history. Because when you think about your ancestors who came to these shores, they came here with the doctrine of discovery, believing that they had a God given right to take it away from the people that were already here. That doctrine of discovery goes back to the papal bulls, where in the 1400s, a foreign religious leader declared indigenous people to be fractionated human beings, 2-part human, 1-part animal, and then instructed his followers to go out on the road and by any means necessary to convert them to that foreign religion. When they hit this beautiful river where I'm at, the Missouri River, our name for it is Minnesota. That was the original name for that water. Minnesota means turbulent water. But when they hit that Western expansion, hit that river, they came here in the spirit of manifest destiny. And again, believing they had a God given right to take it away from the people that were already here. And the narrative they created was, well, they're not Christian and it's underdeveloped, it's undeveloped, but that's not true. Our ancestral lands are highly developed with trade networks spanning coast to coast, pole to pole. Wherever my ancestors walked, you're in a site of religious and cultural significance to me. A lot of people don't realize that when you look at the Indian wars, they don't understand why my ancestors were fighting. But part of the reason, not the whole reason, was because that Western expansion, building those telegraphs and those railroads, you were disrupting migrational patterns of animal nations. So my ancestors knew when to be in certain spots at certain times of the year because that's when the animals were going to migrate. So when all of that was disrupted, he also disrupted their ability to take care of everyone that they loved, everyone that they cherished. Even this horse. And I don't like, just like many of you, and I've been following on Facebook, and just like many of you, I don't like those collars. I don't like those collars at all because I don't think you have to be using GPS spatial data to figure out where a horse is going within a confined area. Um, my family, and I almost feel like I'm the last generation of that because my family taught me how to live with the land, how to know the seasons, how to know the names of the moons, because our Lakota names of the moons tell us what to prepare for in our environment. They taught me how to harvest traditional foods and medicines, how to hunt, how to fish. The way that we harvest and the way that we hunt actually stimulates growth. Doesn't have any type of a negative cumulative effect on our environment. It actually stimulates growth. But it's unfortunate that that road that my family prepared me for doesn't even exist anymore. If we're going to be talking about wild horses, we need to talk about our environment as well. Our environment is collapsing. And it's also unfortunate that the American government seems to be one of the only governments in the world in denial of what's happening in our climate. But we had prophecies. We knew this was coming. It's unfortunate that people don't reach out to us because the sacred knowledge is kept by our women. The oral history is kept by the men. And I think that if they were to bring, and I don't like that word indigenous, because indigenous to me seems to create separations between you and I. And it also means dominated people. And I refuse to allow any culture to have any sort of dominance over me and mine. We got to learn how to live in this place together. We need to start thinking about habitat restoration, because when those immigrants came, they brought their animals with them from the old country, and they brought the grain to produce crops to feed those animals and feed themselves that are now starting to have a huge cumulative impact on our land. And everywhere I go, I see invasive species thriving and native prairie disappearing. And everywhere I go, I see dead or dying trees, and I keep wondering to myself, where have all the birds gone? Because here along this beautiful river, we used to witness these beautiful, powerful, and huge migrations of migratory birds, spring and the fall. And the sound was deafening, and they used to blacken the sky. It's not like that anymore. Our names for our moons, like I said earlier, that prepared us, helped us understand what was happening in the environment, it's not even accurate anymore. We go to harvest our medicines, we know by the stars when to go look, and it's all off. Things are harvesting a month before they should, ripening a month before they should, or a month after, and everything's out of whack out there. And I guarantee it's affecting these horses. Because when I think about the wisdom of a horse can sense a thunderstorm 1 to 2 days ahead of time on a clear blue sky. A horse can sense that thunderstorm coming. And many of you probably witnessed it. The whole herd will get animated. The whole herd will just get animated with that energy of those thunders that are coming. Run, jump, kick, buck. That's them telling you that their relatives are coming. Prepare. The same thing happens in the transition from fall to winter. That first blizzard comes, that herd will tell you that's coming on a beautiful, calm, blue day, 1 to 2 days ahead of time. All of a sudden, they'll become animated. All be running around, jumping, kicking, and bucking because they're excited that their relatives are coming. A horse is so powerfully connected in ways that we can't possibly hope to be, that they can sense death. We've had numerous experiences here in my homelands, funeral processions going along highways and by pastures where the horses are, and seeing horses come charging over the hill and line up, paying their respects. They can sense death. They can sense pain and suffering and sickness. And that's why these growing fields of whatever you want to call it, equine therapy, equine assisted psychotherapy, therapeutic horsemanship, therapeutic riding, are starting to gain such a momentum, is because people are starting to realize that horses have this ability. That they have this ability to heal. And I can use, I have many examples, but I'll share one with you. Years ago, I was called by one of my brother-in-laws who was teaching at the middle school here at Standing Rock. And he asked me, he said, Tahan's our word for brother-in-law. I said, Tahan, he said, if I bring some kids to the rodeo grounds, can you bring some horses up? So I said, yeah, sure. So we agreed upon a date and a time and location. And I thought he was bringing like a carload or maybe a van load, but he brought the whole dang school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And they pulled up in a caravan of buses and they turned him loose. As soon as they open those doors, boy, it was like a tidal wave. Those kids come running out, and jumping over the corral rails, and pretty soon they're up in the crow's nest. They're behind the shoes. They were just all over the place. And the teachers were kind of standing with each other, so I went and stood by them, and they didn't seem to know how to handle the situation. So in my language, I yelled out, "Anahota po." What that means is listen. There, all those kids stopped what they were doing. They turned and looked at me. I said, "Lacho chokata uopo." I told them, I said, "Come to the center." Here they all came and sat down, or they all came and stood by us. So I told them, I said, in Lakota worldview, I said, many of you are the age of my nieces and my nephews, so you're not allowed to call me John. You're not allowed to call me Mr. Eagle. If you address me, you need to say Lekshi. That's our word for uncle. I said, because I look at you as my nieces and nephews, I said, sit down. 300 kids dropped on their butts. And it was funny because the teachers looked just like stunned and mystified. And one of the cultural teachers there, he said, that's what they needed. It's about connection. And that's what the wisdom of a horse is. It's about connection. So, anyways, I talked to them for a little bit. And I told them, I said, go stand on the west side of this arena. We were in a rodeo ground. So I said, go stand on the west side there. I said, and just kind of find a comfort zone. So they all kind of walked over there and they were standing. Pretty soon I turned 5 horses loose. And the only instructions I gave them was don't reach out for them. Just stand still and let's see what they're going to do. So I turned those 5 horses loose, and those horses weaved their ways in and out of those kids. And here there was a group of kids that had segregated themselves. They had separated from the larger group. And darn if all 5 of those horses didn't end up over there to where those group of kids were. And pretty soon the horses were standing behind us kids with their heads over their shoulders, looking back at me. And I was standing in the center with the teachers, and I asked one of those teachers, I said, are those your special needs students? I heard that teacher started to cry. You didn't have to tell that horse that. You didn't have to tell those horses that all those children that were gathered in that arena, those were the ones that needed help right now. Ksapa. They have a wisdom of spirit all their own. Can't train a horse to do that. I had another experience down in Kyle, South Dakota, amongst our relatives, the Oglala people. We had agreed on a time and a place and 5 horses. Again, I was working with the middle school, Little Wound School in Kyle. When I get there, there's no horses. And we're standing there waiting, visiting. And pretty soon this girl shows up and she's on a ATV. And she said, how many horses you want? I said, well, bring 5 down. So we stood there for about a half an hour watching this girl chase those horses around on this ATV. Finally, she got 4 of them into the rodeo arena, but there was one that would keep this tree between her and itself. And right about the time that she gave up, then that horse came running and went into the crowd. So I asked her, I said, tell me about your horses. She had good things to say about 4 of them, except for that one horse, that last one. And she said, you're not going to be able to do anything with her. She doesn't like people. So, okay. And then she jumps on her ATV and she takes off. We get into the crowds. Ask for 5 volunteers, 4 boys come out and a girl. I give them real simple instruction. And all I said is, if that horse represented your higher power, whatever that higher power is, whether you refer to as God or in our language would say Tukashla. So I want you to go out and develop a relationship with your higher power. And I stepped out of the way. Well, of course, they don't know quite what to think, right? They don't know quite what I'm asking. But they go out and I watch those 4 boys. And those 4 boys connected like that. But this girl, that horse that owner said didn't like people and you weren't going to have nothing, be able to do anything with it, was standing way at the far end of the rodeo arena. And there, when that girl stepped forward, that horse turned and faced her. When that girl noticed it, she stopped and she put her head down. That horse walked towards her. She looked up, the horse stopped. She took some tentative steps towards it, and it was this beautiful dance. as I watched those two close the arena. Well, as I was debriefing it, I debriefed those four boys first because I knew that something happened with that girl. There was something real profound that happened. So when it was her turn, I just told her, I said, I noticed that when you took a step towards that horse, that horse turned and looked at you. She said, yeah. I said, well, what do you think about that? She just kind of shrugged her shoulders. She didn't know. So I kept talking. I said, I noticed that when you guys got up close to each other, that horse reached around with its head and pulled you back here by its flank. She said, yeah. So what do you think about that? And she said, it knows what I'm going through. Because think about that. This horse reached for that girl gently with its head and put it back here by its flank. Why would it do that? Where does it keep its foals? Where does it protect its young? Puts it back there by its flank. So anyways, that girl said, it knows what I'm going through. So I asked her, I said, well, what are you going through? Here, she started crying and she said, my mom just died. Those teachers that were there, not one of them knew that. Those kids that were there, not one of them knew that. But that horse knew. And that horse was mothering her in a way that oftentimes we fail to see. And I just use those two as stories as examples that much more than a horse. They're spiritual beings, deeply connected to everything in creation. But when we fence them in, like what's happening at Theodore Roosevelt National Parks happened there for generations, right? When they fence them in, you create a unnatural space for them. When we put them in pastures and corrals and pens, we create a unnatural space for them. And it affects how they perceive themselves, it affects how they perceive others. The other thing that we seem to not understand is that whatever energy you're carrying in that moment when you try to interact with the horse, you're projecting that to that horse. That horse is going to reflect that energy back to you. I have a father-in-law, and I'm not going to say quote him word for word, but at a gathering here on Standing Rock of Horse People, he told them, he said, if you're a no good son of a blank, he said, your horse is going to be a no good son of a blank too. There's a truth to that. So when I think about these, again, quote unquote, wild horses and the ways that they're rounded up, unnecessary. And I don't know all the history. I don't know if they've ever asked for Native peoples to assist. They did with me this year at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. They offered me that opportunity to be there with them, but I turned it down because I wasn't going to have any say. And I didn't want them to turn around and say, well, there was a Native American standing here when we did this. I didn't want my participation to be interpreted as consent to what they were doing. So I chose not to go. But again, if you lift your energy, it pushes them away from you. If you draw your energy in, it draws them to you. I always wonder when I watch these things on videos, I wonder why those cowboys don't understand that. I wonder why those wranglers don't understand that. Just another way that if you're going to round horses up, you can do it. And, my pasture, and I was going to share a video, but I decided against it. But my horses come to a whistle, even my untouched horses. And that's the beauty of some of you advocates out there is I see the pictures. I love looking at the pictures. I see the videos. That's why I have that ability with my horses is because all my spare time, just like you, I'm out there with horses. Not always doing things, sometimes just sitting. And I've had these profound experiences where they come, they share that sacred breath with even these quote unquote wild horses. So Shumna Ksapa, wisdom of the spirit of a horse. They have a wisdom and an understanding and a spirit that goes beyond us. But you know what? The other thing I want to share with you is, the sun came up in the east, it's going over our head, it's going to set in the west. And if we're fortunate, if we're lucky enough, we get to see that again tomorrow. There's nowhere in this world are you guaranteed tomorrow. So we're supposed to be living today in the best way that we can. Right now we're in winter, and pretty soon we're going to transition to spring, and then summer, and then fall, and then that whole cycle repeats itself again. We're inhaling oxygen, exhaling carbon, I think it's dioxide. Trees are inhaling that carbon dioxide, exhaling oxygen. Sacred motion. Water evaporates, goes to the sky, comes back as rain. Sacred motion. Our earth, it might look like we're sitting still, but we're not, because we know that Unchumach, grandmother earth, is turning. She's just not hanging out in space all by herself. All of her relatives, there's that same sacred motion. And I share that with you because if all you can see with are your eyes, you're always going to be limited in what you perceive in this world. But if you can learn to see with that Nagi, that spirit, you're going to be able to look all the way out into the universe and acknowledge your relationship to everything in creation. And that sacred connection, it's right there in your fingerprint. When you have the time, I want you to study your fingerprint. You're going to see that sacred motion. All these cycles that I just described. Next time you go out to your horses, look for that. You're going to find them up here. Sometimes on their neck, sometimes on their chest, sometimes on above their flanks. Sacred connections. So you, my relatives, whether you realize it or not, are descendant of ancient people too, that were deeply connected to their environment, that had a sacred language just like my language. But today there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect. One thing I know about ancient peoples and ancient DNA is that that connection can be triggered. You have to create the environment to trigger that connection. But with that, I'm like Forrest Gump. When my mind blanks out, I know that's all I got to say about that. I'll go ahead and turn this back over to Chris. And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, John. That was absolutely beautiful. I have a few questions for you, and then if anyone else has questions, I know there's a couple, but put them into the chat. You talked about a couple things with generational trauma. You mentioned, and when you said that, and when you talked about how we don't ever go to the tribes and ask them for their advice or their thoughts, I want to say that I think that we have a almost generational shame. We I'm very sorry for the way that our people have treated your people, and I don't know um how we start to repair that. So I think that that keeps us from approaching Native American people sometime, because I think the shame, when I was thinking about, like, why don't we, right? Why don't we contact tribal people more? And I think part of it is that, we've we've taken your people, and you had this great beautiful land, and now, like you said, you're limited to the Standing Rock community. So I think that shame plays a part of it. So how do we overcome that, and how can advocates reach out to different Native American tribes in their areas, or in these areas where horses are being, um, there's a lot of horses that are going to be zeroed out this year, where they're going to take them from their lands. How do we get the tribes involved, and how do we take those first steps to repair our relationships that way as advocates?
I think the same way and approach that we all take in working with horses. Working with horses takes patience, understanding, consistency, and forgiveness. Because a lot of Native people, when you think about it, and this is something that Americans don't understand about us, is we have absolutely no reason to trust. Absolutely no reason to trust the federal government, because every treaty they made with Native peoples in this land, they broke. But I want to share something with you, Chris, is that back in the 90s, when we were doing a lot of work on historical trauma and intergenerational grief, and we're presenting at regional and national conferences, we'd have a lot of people come up just and express what you just expressed, feeling bad about, what happened in the past. But and again, I don't want to offend anybody, but I'm going to talk honest with you. We ourselves coined a phrase back then in the late 90s, and we called it white guilt, because it was white people that were coming up to us expressing more shame, whatever it is you want to say. But I want to say to you, Chris, is that you weren't there back in the 1800s when these wars were fought. You weren't there. You're not the one who forcibly removed us off our land. So there's no reason for you to be carrying that. And I think that's one of the things that we got to sort through, right? Is that even us as natives, our history hurts. And there's a time, when you're young, our history, because it hurts, it makes you angry. But now, I'm at this age, this point in my life where I got more days behind me than I do in front of me. Life looks different. And I understand the power in creating relationships. And I think that's the way, Chris, is that we just have to create relationships, but have that understanding when you approach Native people that they have absolutely no reason to trust you. Absolutely no reason to trust you. But it takes patience, understanding, consistency, and forgiveness. But forgiveness is a process, I don't know how many times I see people get in arguments, get in fights, and shake hands, say, I forgive you, and walk away. That no good son of a forgiveness is kind of a superficial thing in this culture, but I mean forgiveness, to actually shake hands and let go. You're going to let go of what that was that created this disconnect. That's a process that's going to take some time. Good question.
But through the Western states, there are different tribal offices, correct? There are all kinds of tribal lands. So I think that we have to overcome that fear, I think is what you're saying. And we can contact the tribal offices. And I know I did that with the MHA Nation too, and said, hey, do you hear what's happening at Theodore Roosevelt National Park? Can you guys step forward and speak up, do a resolution, things like that? So I think just taking those steps, I think that that's something that we don't realize in advocacy. But that's something that you would recommend, just taking that first step and reaching out as advocates to tribal offices?
I think so. A lot of tribes have tribal historic preservation officers, which are federally funded positions through the National Park Service. So I know that in the past, when you reached out to me and other advocate groups reached out to me, I told you guys that I was drafting letters, that I was in consultation with the park. But because those are federal things that go into federal documents and federal files, they might not be open with wanting to tell you what they're writing in those things. But TIPOs, that's what they refer to them, tribal historic preservation officers, work with state historic preservation officers. They if they themselves don't have the time, I'm sure that they can get you in touch with elders or horse people amongst them that would have the time to help you. But here's again the challenge, right, Chris, is that our greatest challenge when looking at that EA and Theodore Roosevelt National Park is they termed them livestock. We were trying to help them understand that they're not livestock, they're sacred beings, sacred spiritual beings. But when you come from two different cultures and two different worldviews, it takes patience, understanding, consistency, and forgiveness to get to that place where you can develop those greater relationships.
I'm going to ask you another question. We touched on this a little bit before we opened up the chat, and I know it's something on a lot of people's minds. We know that Governor Doug Burgum was great here with our Theodore Roosevelt horses, and he was very outspoken and very passionate about keeping them in the park. And a lot of people wonder, what is he going to be like as the Secretary of the Interior? And I know we can't predict the future, but just some thoughts on, I don't know how much you've interacted with Governor Burgum in the past, while he was governor here, especially as a tribal historic preservation officer.
Another good question. Well, tribes today are actually under the Department of Interior. our we refer to them as IRA governments. They were formed under the Indian Reorganization Act, and it was a federal law that they forced upon us. It was the only way that my grandparents and great grandparents could keep our lands in the federal trust. So we don't actually own the land, it's kept in federal trust for us. So we have direct government to government consultation with Department of Interior. I'm gonna call him Doug, because Doug's actually been in my home when he became governor. Um, Sioux tribe and North Dakota were in some very challenging times with each other, weren't seeing eye to eye. And he kind of went an extra step. He went the extra mile trying to create that relationship with us. Those times that he was in my office and our council chambers, times that we were up in his office. I think deep down, Doug is a good guy, but I have absolutely no reason to trust Chris. And I saw a shift in him when Biden became president. You start seeing a lot of politicians declaring himself as MAGA Republicans, and that's what I saw in him. Was all of a sudden he calling himself a MAGA Republican. Now he's appointed Secretary of Interior under Trump's administration. You know, to us personally, it doesn't matter who's out in that chair in Washington, D.C., because it never reaches us. We don't benefit in any way. But during Trump's last administration, he waged a secret war against Native Americans in our sacred places. Went after national parks. He's going to do it again. He went after some of our traditional cultural landscapes in the name of the extractive industries. So it's going to be interesting. And it's going to be it's Doug's opportunity to show us his grit, because even though he had a good relationship with tribes here in the state of North Dakota, his boss has taken some executive orders, executive actions, freezing federal funding to tribes, freezing federal funding to tribal colleges. My daughter is going to graduate this spring with a bachelor's degree in environmental science and was invited to speak at the National Science Foundation in Washington, D.C. to present her research at an undergraduate level. And now she can't go because Trump's executive order freezing those funding to those tribal colleges. So I don't know what Doug's going to be able to do about any of that. When your boss tells you to do something, unfortunately, you're going to have to do it.
Can you talk about or maybe help us understand, and I don't know how if you had any interactions with her, but I know as wild horse advocates, we were all really excited when Secretary Holland was appointed to Secretary of the Interior, and we really thought that she would show up for the horses, and we feel like she failed. Um, do you have any thoughts or insights on that?
Yeah, so when Deb Holland ran for Congress, she promised Native people that she was going to be fierce. That was her campaign promise. So she was going to be fierce. And as Secretary of Interior, there were many initiatives created through her office that gave tribes an opportunity to vent. It didn't give us a greater voice. You know, there was no teeth to anything that she did, but it gave us opportunities to vent with higher up federal officials. Kind of opened some of our own traumas, because I know there was a boarding school initiative where anyone that had boarding schools, they had to contact tribes and make them aware of the cemeteries there because of how many children died with those residential schools and never made it home. But again, that's the challenge that Doug's going to have, right? You had President Biden who ran, and we'd have all those really cool meetings with tribal leaders in Washington, D.C., but nothing ever came of it. It didn't help us and our sacred places in any way. So I don't put my faith in politicians anyways, because very few of them are actual leaders. But I put my faith in the creator. What we say Tunkashla or Wakantanka. And I put my understanding and my belief in the greater good, that when people get motivated to action, create those relationships with one another. Because our chief, and we still he still guides us, even though he's been gone as long as he's gone. But Sitting Bull, he told us, let's put our minds together and see what life we can make for our children. He didn't say there's one hero out there. He said, let's put our minds together. So that's how I'm looking at all these names on my screen and what you've done these past few days and what you've done in the past and what you continue to do is to try to put these minds together to see what life can make for our children, which hopefully in the future horses have something to do with.
So I think really kind of what you're saying, whether it's Secretary Howland, Secretary Burgum, whatever you want to say, it's not necessarily their initiatives, their thoughts, them as people. It's the policies again that have to change, correct?
So that's the other thing too. Is remember I mentioned the papal bulls and Doctrine of Discovery and Manifest Destiny, where they believed they had a God-given right to take it away because my ancestors weren't Christian. Um, that's so deeply ingrained in American laws and institutions that Americans don't even realize they're still perpetuating that. Doctrine of Discovery and Manifest Destiny. Why do you think that a federal agency has so much say over these horses, and those of us that live out here with them don't?
I heard you talk when I went to listen to you speak last year, and you elaborated a little bit more, and I'm hoping you can now about sharing a breath with a horse for one, and then also their thumbprint. Can you elaborate on those two things? And then also, how do we learn to experience that, especially when we're in places like on federal lands where, there are regulations to stay a distance away? And also our fears in general of, like you said, this horse can kill me, right? If this horse is stronger, smarter, faster than me, how do we, so just kind of those three things, and then I'll go to some questions that people are asking.
Yeah. So again, when the horse really wants to be in our day, and when they sense that you need help, they're going to want to be right here. They're going to walk up to you and they're going to put their face right in yours. And my experience has been, even though people will say, yeah, I've been around horses all my life, at that point, they shoo them away. I always have to tell people that that horse eats grass. It doesn't eat meat. It's not
Yeah.
trying to bite you. It's not trying to eat you. It's trying to help you by exchanging this breath. And I actually had that experience at Theodore Roosevelt National Park when I was a tribal stock preservation officer. I set up a meeting. I told them I wanted to see those horses, and they took me into an area, and there was three band stallions there with their bands of mares, and then there was a group of bachelor stallions off in the distance. And of course, I walked in with Blake McCann, and there was a couple national park intern people, seasonal people with us. I just told them, I said, can you just wait here? I want to go in. I want to see if I can track my ancestors' horses. So I went in, and it's probably a good thing that day I didn't know that there was a some kind of ordinance that we're supposed to keep our distance, because I was like this within those three bands of three stallions and their bands of mares, and one of the stallions actually came up to me, and people oftentimes misinterpret the behavior. So he was a band stallion, right? So when he came up, he just lifted all of his energy and he puffed himself up, and he come up prancing like that and calling out with his voice and tossing his head and his tail, walked up to me and started pawing at the ground right in front of me. I didn't react because I was introduced to that behavior as a little boy. So I didn't react. I just stood there looking at him, talking to him. I kept calm, and he turned and ran off. It wasn't a sign of aggression, you know. My ancestors understood that type of behavior too, because if you have the courage to climb on their back, they have the courage to carry you. And it's Western horsemanship. It's the things that we do that creates those opportunities for a horse to kick and to buck and to. And I'm not saying that, I'm no Pat Pirelli or I'm not anything like that. I'm just a Hunchpapa that was raised by horse people, and very fortunate that that connection was never lost in my family. My great great grandfather came to Standing Rock with Sitting Bull. He listed as his property one horse. Now to go to address the other part of your question, what you call a thumbprint, that swirl. mainstream society launched something out in the galaxy, right? And it starts sending images back. So what shapes were those solar systems out there? What shapes were those other galaxies? Spirals. And it's an ancient symbol. It's an ancient symbol that's found in Ireland, it's found in England, it's found in Egypt, but it's also found here, this continent, because the ancient peoples understood star knowledge. So there used to be a belief that the placement of that on their forehead can give you insight into their temperaments, whether they're hot-blooded or cold-blooded, or it's just like, anyone that ever gone to a sale looking to buy a horse, what is it that we're taught to look for? Well, some people look for the bloodlines, some people look for the color, some people look for the conformation, but other people look for the disposition. How did that horse react when I walked into that pen? Did it show me the whitest eyes, or did it stay calm? Did it move away from me, or did it come towards me? And people oftentimes don't realize that that's how horses are communicating, because I've never heard a horse go, never heard a horse make those sounds before in my life, but I always see people doing that to them. Horses communicate through energy. They communicate through energy. That's why they can tell if you're sad, or they can tell if you're angry, communicating through energy. But they also communicate through body language. So there are studies that suggest that 93% of our communication is nonverbal. Now think about that, 93% of our communication being nonverbal, which means we're only communicating with our voice 7% of the time. But it's that nonverbal communication that oftentimes people really aren't aware of. I'm sure people had that experience where you had some kind of interaction with somebody and they got upset and walked away, and you're sitting there scratching the head thinking, well, what did I do? Not realizing it might have been the nonverbal communication that they were picking up on. Good questions.
So I'm curious, what was the stallion telling you then when he came up to you like that?
Well, I think one was to be respectful, because everything that he cherished was behind him. That's really a good question, because now what popped in my mind is, so my family are descendants of Chantetis, Kici, Strong Heart Society members. And they were referred to as Sitting Bull's boys. They were some of his most loyal warriors. But the Strong Hearts, on their shields, used to wear a red cloth around it. On their lances, on their bows, they'd drape red cloths, red streamers on it. And the reason for that was so that at a distance, if you were trying to provoke at a distance, you knew who you were going to fight. You knew that you were going to fight the Strong Hearts. Maybe it was something like that with him. That, respect my family, respect my space. If not, I'm the one that you're going to have to deal with. And the fact, think about not reacting is you can de-escalate behaviors in people and horses and dogs by not reacting to the negative stuff and only reacting to the positive stuff. But to be
Exactly.
honest, Chris, I don't know.
All right, Linda wants to know, what would the correct word be instead of wild horses?
I think that would be an interesting journey for all of you. To look back through your family trees, to look back through your history, to find those point of origins was, how did your ancestors refer to them? Because even though we know English is a Germanic language, it's heavily influenced by Latin languages, and it's such a garbled thing now. When I went to the United States, and I don't remember if I told you guys this, but when I joined the United States Army, they asked me if I spoke a foreign language, and I said, yes, English. This isn't it. But many of you, all of you actually, are descendants of ancient people, have that same ancient DNA that I have that same ancient connection to everything in the universe. But you have to create the environment to trigger that DNA. So for me, when I'm amongst my people, I just call them what we were taught to call them. That was our cherished horse nation, or and for us in language revitalization, because our language is still intact, but it's real fragile right now. I've given all my horses Lakota names. And the reason for that is, so that my wife and my children and my grandchildren were out there to the horses have to practice and utilize that language.
Someone asked, because you talked a lot about rodeos, the understanding among advocates, and a lot of advocates believe this, that rodeos are famous for cruelty to horses and that rodeo people support horse slaughter. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know if that's true or not. I myself oftentimes used to refer to myself as a recovering cowboy because I grew up on a ranch. I remember, I think it was like 1975, 1976 when my dad got his very first four-wheel drive pickup. Now, there was no such things as ATVs and side by sides back then. If you wanted to go round cattle up, or if you wanted to go out, check fence or check on animals, you had to catch a horse. But there was a certain point in my own development where all of a sudden I realized some of the things we were doing was abusive. We were breaking their spirits. And the odd thing about that is my dad wasn't like that. When I'd spend time with my dad, away from my uncles and my older cousins and family and friends, my dad was different with horses. My dad really had a different way with horses. I never saw a horse buck with him. It was the strangest thing. But in time, I was able to pick that up. But rodeo people, we find all kinds of reasons not to like each other. We find all types of excuses not to have those relationships. Oh, they're from the blue aisle, they're from the red aisle. Oh, that's left wing, right wing, without even realizing or understanding those wings of the same bird. They're North Dakota and South Dakota and the other natives. That's one of the things that has to stop because I'm kind of thankful for the cowboys and Indians in my family because in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that was the only thing they were allowed to do. As our culture and spiritual life and language and ceremonies was being torn away, they had to assimilate. And at the time, that's what there was. That was the only way they could keep that connection to horses with us until we can get to this place where we are today, where we're making our spiritual beliefs, our language, and our understandings live again and finding our way back to how our ancestors worked with horses. Because, during their time, there was no horse trailers and there was no, portable corral panels. And it's in our point of origin story on how they created relationships with horses. And I had some people come to me one time and they said, well, how were you moving from camp to camp with your horses following you? So I said, well, where are my horses at? And they were all standing along the hillside. I said, just like that. If you spend, all your free time with them, they're going to seek out your attention. They're going to be around you. So I don't know. And I've had a lot of road people come to me, and I'm not going to mention names because a couple of them were road champions. And they just at some point in their own development realized that there had to be a better way, that what they were doing, what they were taught, what they were experiencing was actually abusive. They were looking for a different way, looking for a better way of being with the horse.
Craig wants to know, how can we return to living in harmony with the great rest of life, like nature? Seems the human problem today is trying to overly control and manipulate other species and their habitats rather than learning to understand and respect them in their own right. And this certainly applies to horses and burros and their right to be themselves, to be free, and have a natural whole world to live in.
Hmm. That's a really good question. That's a question that we could probably spend years talking about. But what you brought to my mind and listening to that was we have a saying in my language that we hear my people pray. We don't say amen at the end. What we say is matakwe oasi. Matakwe oasi means it's an acknowledgement of everything that you're related to around you and everything above and below you. It's that acknowledgement that you're related to everything, all my relatives, all my relations. And even though I come from a culture and a language like that, the very first time I ever experienced that, though, the very first time I ever felt that was north of Durango, Colorado. I had transferred out of Sitting Bull College to Durango, Colorado, Fort Lewis College to study sociology. Got homesick one day, asked one of my buddies if I could borrow his car. And I drive up the highway north of Durango. I find this logging road. I follow it for a while. It turns into a two trail, and pretty soon I end up on top of this cliff. I'm in this beautiful, beautiful valley that's stretching from the path in the north of me to, down to the south to where Durango was. And I shut the vehicle off. I get out. I sit down on the cliff and I kind of hang my legs. No, I wasn't going to jump. I didn't have thoughts like that, but I hung my legs over the end there, and I was just kind of sitting and sitting there quiet. All of a sudden, I became aware of things like down in the valley below me. I could hear something moving, and as I was sitting there watching, I saw this herd of elk. As I was sitting there looking, and it would happen in the fall time. So it looked like this beautiful patchwork quilt, all those fall colors. And all of a sudden, I could hear the wind. And even though I couldn't see the wind, I could follow it with my eyes because it was moving all those treetops like a wave. And it was in that moment, sitting there by myself, that I felt that for the first time in my life, that we are related to everything in creation, that we are connected to everything in creation. And part of that spiritual development, there was this time and ceremony when I was having a real hard time and everything was falling apart around me. Everything was going that everybody who loved me into being came back again. Everybody who loved me into being came back again. In a thought, in a memory, in a teaching, and in a song. And I realized then that when I have those moments, because you're going to have those moments, right? You're going to have good days and bad days. But when you have those moments where everything's falling apart around you, if you make a decision from there, it's not a good decision. You're making a decision from your emotions. But if you can center yourself in that experience, in that energy, everybody who loved you into being is going to come back again. And you can make your decision from the center. So maybe that's one of the answers, because people have strong beliefs, one side or the other, and if having conversations and the person you're talking to doesn't look at things in the same way, I've seen people get into arguments over things like that because they start making decisions and comments from their emotions rather than making decisions and comments from their center. But I think the easiest answer is I don't know.
People are asking how they can contact you. I don't know. And then Heather, maybe if you can put something, type it in the chat box so people can have it. What's the best way for people to contact you?
Probably through my email, the spirit of the horse at yahoo.com.
Okay.
Spirit
Um,
at yahoo.com. I also have a website, becoming one with the spirit of the horse.com.
Tammy said she's been in meetings with the peyote and their vision of the horse is one of disrespect. I don't know if you know anything about that. She said even wanting open hunting seasons. So she says, how do we help others understand the importance of the spirit of the horse and their importance to the health of the land?
Imawaka. I had an elder was a very good friend of mine and helped me on my spiritual journey, but he was always telling me stories about his grandparents. But of the two, the grandma must have really been something to him because he was always talking about her. And he said one day, my grandma said to me, Imawaka. And then he quit talking. So I was standing there thinking about what he had just expressed, trying to understand it. Because it was such an older dialect than what I speak. Finally, he said, in my voice is the ability to hurt and the ability to heal. It's the same way for you. So I think that's one of the things we have to be conscious about, is because we're primarily made up of water. For us Lakota, our first medicine was water. Our mothers carried us in water for 9 months. Water reacts to thoughts, to spoken word, to sound. That's why even today, when our ceremonies, we pray with water to stimulate all that goodness in it. But people need to kind of get back to those understandings that in your voice, you can hurt and you can heal. When we hurt people, all it does is, or if we offend people or discredit people or disrespect people, all it does is just like lifting your energy with the horse. It pushes them away from you. So one of the things horses have taught me is that it's all about relationships. It's all about creating that relationship. Because if you create this, that's a hard thing to get over. But if you can create this, then things move forward. How you approach a horse, a dog, a person, or any given situation in your life, it's either going to create resistance or it's going to create movement. The only way to create that movement is to develop a relationship first.
Deborah said, your talk has been meaningful and your voice is so helpful. She runs a sanctuary in Utah. They've rescued at least 16 wild reservation babies and have also invited a native healer to bless them. How can we remind the younger native youth generations of the value of their wild horses and animals in general? Sadly, it seems some of the connection to the natural world has been lost. Of course, American progress is to blame for a good part of it. The kids they rescued were in the slaughter pipeline.
Hmm. If you go out in the creation, let's say you come across a nest. That nest has these baby birds that had just hatched, calling out for the mom. If you go up there and you handle one of those baby birds, I don't care how tenderly and how loving you handle that baby bird, put it back in that nest, when that mama comes back, she's going to abandon that baby bird. It's the same thing with puppies. Puppies are first born, they're totally dependent upon their mom. If you pick that puppy up and you put your smell all over it and you put your energy all over it and put it back, that mom's going to abandon that puppy. And unfortunately, I think that's what happened to my people, this forced removal, not only from our ancestral lands, but the forced removal of children. Where, it's an unfortunate part of American history. It was Christianity and the United States government that created those residential schools where they're handling those children, those sacred ones. Those children came back and they were different again. I don't know that that's as much a challenge for you as it is for those tribal nations, because, like I said, my culture, my language, my spirituality is intact, but it's fragile, and it's up to us to make these things live again. So internally, there's a lot of things that it doesn't get published, but there's a lot of efforts to do just that, because our people realize and understand and believe that it shouldn't be a school's responsibility either to teach a language and culture and spirituality. That goes back to the family. So we have to make the families live again. And unfortunately, none of you on this call is going to be able to do that for us. We have to do that for ourselves.
I'm going to ask one more question. And a lot of people have said, they can sit here and listen to you all day. So thank you again for this. And I will open to you that if you ever want to do any kind of a talk with this, like this again, we can always set something up over Zoom and we can just sit and chat all day long. Tammy asks, and so I'm going to make this the last question, and it's probably the hardest one. Do you think Mother Earth will ever recover from this? And that's probably a topic for a whole nother horse talk, right?
We had a prophecy that when the animal nations show their sacred color, that we're going to be at the crossroads. And of course, nobody really understood what that meant. What does that mean to be at the crossroads? But it happened in, of all places, Jamestown, North Dakota. A white buffalo calf was born. And tribal people, it heralded that time, moving into that time where animal nations were going to show their sacred color, and we're going to be at the crossroads. And from that time till now, I think there was a white buffalo calf born in one of the national parks out west last year. We've heard sightings of white moose and white bears and eagles and elk and deer, and the animal nations were showing their sacred color. But it was about maybe in the mid 2000s that we realized what that crossroads was. It was our environment. We were in a place where either we were going to be able to affect that change, things were going to go back, or mainstream society was going to take us over that precipice with them. And unfortunately, the latter was true. They took us over that precipice. So now we have to evolve. Now we have to evolve. And I'm going to challenge you. Go back and look. There's studies out there that show how many species, animals, birds, fish, insects, plants, how many species have perished, are no longer here anymore. And when you take one species out of the environment, it affects multiple species and they collapse. But if you were to take us out of the environment, everything would thrive again. Everything would come back into balance. So maybe that's part of the solution is we have to figure out how to have a small ecological footprint on the land, but also start looking at habitat restoration. Because all these things that the immigrants found in this environment when they came here was here because it was meant to be here. So again, you take something out of that, it affects many other things. Good question. I thought I was just going to talk. I didn't know you were all going to make me think.
Well, again, I appreciate you taking this time. I appreciate all of the wisdom that you've shared. And more than anything, John, I appreciate hopefully the start of a really wonderful friendship that we're forming. So thank you again. And again, our platform is open to you anytime that you want to talk about anything. And I do encourage you to look at John's website, look at his Facebook page, and he does have a wealth of knowledge to share. So thank you again, John. Everybody is saying how wonderful this was. So thank you.
Thank all of you for listening. And remember, it's not me. I'm nothing and nobody. It's my elders who invested in me. That's all I carry because I'm, even though I'm old, I'm not old enough to have attained my own wisdom. I just can share their teachings, the things that they shared with me. So with that, I hope you all have a good rest of your day and are happy, healthy, and safe. Thanks again,
Thank
Chris.
you. Thank you, everybody.